we're just going to move right into having Molly come up and work with us now. And we're a little behind on our schedule, so I'll just get her right into it. We'll use the same structures as we move through it, but we'll help you with the time.
I'm amazed there's no clock in here. Maybe that's by design.
There's a clock.
It's over there. Can you see it in the corner? Behind the cake.
Okay, well, so now we've started out acknowledging how old I am, because there's no way I am. And tell me if I get too loud, because I share an office with folks who tell me I'm loud all day long, and so I always worry when I'm with my microphone. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's my privilege that you would invite us in, the university and Cooperative Extension, and my colleagues at Plan New Hampshire and New Hampshire Housing, New Hampshire Listens, and let us share some time with you. And so at Cooperative Extension, my role is education in communities. But what I really do is I share information, I let you all talk about it and digest it, and we're going to learn together. So I'm not going to give you a lecture, and there's no text and quiz. And someone mentioned housing terminology, which we are going to get to later. And I know I'm the barrier before you get to the data guy. So, but I really want to do a first exercise to think a little deeper about our own individual housing experiences. And I know those of you that were here in the fall, you talked about what were your memories about your home as you were growing up and what was special or important about that. And I'm going to take that a little further in a minute. And I want you to think about your home or the places you've lived and the opportunities that have afforded you, or maybe the barriers that where you've lived or where you've wanted to live, and what was in the way of that, because we're going to talk about that in the triads in a minute. So I want to go way out on a limb and tell you my story. And I liked what one of your working agreements was trust. So I know a couple of you, but not a lot of you, but I trust this process and the folks I've met in Peterborough. And I want to tell you my home story, or my story of where I've lived, because I think most people would be surprised to find out, I'm sorry if my back to some folks, that I'm challenged by housing in New Hampshire right now today. And that may be surprising because I work at the university, I have a good job, I have benefits, I have a husband who works, I'm white, I've had a lot of privilege in my life. But I think my experience may be similar to some of you, and so I'll just tell you quickly my story. Grew up in Buffalo, New York. Could anyone tell by my accent? Sometimes people can tell. And yes, we have more snow, but you have more sunshine here in New Hampshire. And I lived in a compact neighborhood that was walkable, but we didn't call it that. We said we could go to our neighbor's house, and our parents let us because there was a sidewalk, and didn't have to work hard to make friends because there were kids everywhere, and parents kept their eye on us. And I think my parents picked that house for the school that they wanted I and my siblings to go to. So I never worried about did I have a place to live or was it safe. And then went to college, actually stayed home for college so I could work full time, so I didn't worry about housing or think about housing at that point. My parents moved to a bigger house as they had more kids. As many people did, you know, they had a starter house and they moved up to a second house. We sort of observe people do that, maybe a little less these days. And then I went to grad school. I had the privilege of doing that, I think because I had lived at home and saved a lot of money, so it was easy and a lot cheaper to go to graduate school 25 years ago. And fell in love, moved to Cleveland, Ohio, got married, had a couple of kids. When we first got married, the first time I remember thinking about housing in a different way was I married a guy who had college debt at a time that we didn't talk about that a lot. And all my friends and siblings got married and bought a house like that. And we had to wait 3 or 4 years because we were paying some student loans off. My husband was from first generation college, parents never owned a home, so he had come from a different place. And I remember, I'll be honest, it was kind of hard to watch, people that I thought I was similar to be able to achieve something that I wasn't there yet. But we eventually bought a home, had 2 kids, bought a house in a first-rate suburb of Cleveland, very old historic neighborhood next to a neighborhood that had a lot of crime issues that we knew about. And over time, those crime issues spilled into the neighborhood we lived in. And at first, we just thought, well, we're like the urban pioneers, and that's what we put up with. And then there was a stabbing in front of our house. 2 gang members, 2 girls, 13 years old. And they both survived, and I don't know what happened to them. But I'll be honest, that crime made me think about our housing differently. And I think it did in part because I had kids. And all of a sudden, I was unsure about where we were living. So it was the first time that crime, or the idea of crime, impacted my thought about where the community I was living in. It so happened at the same time that my husband had a job offer in New England. It was not the reason we left Ohio, but it factored in a little bit. And so we came to the Upper Valley, where we knew the housing would be more expensive. We were very fortunate that my husband's employer had a program at the time, 20 years ago, to help families finance their homes. Because 20 years ago, it was hard to buy a house in the Upper Valley. And that program stopped soon after that, but we took advantage of that. That's how we were able to do that. Actually had to jump the river and ended up in Vermont because it was a little less expensive than being in the Hanover, Lebanon area at the time. And raised our kids in a beautiful little place with a river. But we quickly found out the schools were not what we wanted for our kids and couldn't accommodate the needs of our kids. So we began to think about our housing differently again. And should we be in a place where school's the biggest thing that we need to accomplish? And yet again, another job opportunity for my husband, and we moved to the seacoast, where actually we looked in many neighborhoods for housing, but decided we weren't buying a house, we were buying a school. And we were going to do whatever it took to get our kids into the school that we wanted our kids into. And so that worked for us. We're fortunate that we could afford a house on the seacoast, although we found it challenging to find in our area of finance what seemed affordable to me. Recognizing, I haven't experienced homelessness, and as I said, we've been really fortunate, and our finances have allowed us to do things. So where I am now today, I think, is where the stories I hear in local communities. But both our kids are in and out of college, recently out of college, and they haven't come back. We're hoping they come back. We want them to come back. And there's lots of reasons. Housing's one of them. The social life is just different in big cities when you're 22, and I don't know how we're going to address that here. I'm not sure we want to address that in New Hampshire. Kind of like, do that thing there and then eventually get back here. But what does strike me is that my son is in D.C. He lives in Arlington, Virginia, and he's paying the same rent in an apartment that my nephew's paying in Portsmouth. Right? And so we have a different issue. Different communities have different issues. So one, I'm kind of living that. Are my millennial kids ever coming back to New England? Or what are we going to do? Or back to New Hampshire? What are we going to do to accomplish that? My husband and I are ready to downsize. And we are competing for houses with folks who are buying their first house. We want that smaller house. Less expensive, not in your head, right? Less expensive, maybe one floor, because I'm looking 10, 20 years out, and that's a challenge, and we have not figured that out. And then my biggest housing challenge right now is I have aging parents. And, I have aging parents who are in their early 80s with some health issues, and cannot find housing that they can afford that can accommodate them. And so we'll figure all that out. I'll figure all of that out. But I think those are some of the stories we're hearing across the state. That's just my story. All of your stories will be different. Housing is a very individual experience, but it's what we have in common in community. But what I know in reflecting about my experience is the education I got has a relationship to where I lived. And I did that by design for my children. And I know there's been some barriers along the way. Early on, we had that student loan barrier. Right now, we feel like we have a supply of housing barrier on the seacoast in terms of downsizing. So what we're going to do is you have to get back and you go into new triads, as I understand that. And I'd ask you to think about your housing story over time. And if it's not you, it may be one of your kids or your sisters or a neighbor, but I think we want it to be as personal as can be. And think about the different places you've lived, the choices you've had to make, with the backdrop of what opportunities were afforded you because of those places that you lived, and what barriers may have been there, or what barriers you have right now, or someone in your family has right now in terms of housing. Okay? All right. So they know how to...
Yep, go into your
Okay, thanks.